Jim, the latest information that we received from Darlene Hamlet, that's Lynette's mom, was that Brian told her that after he washed up on shore in Marsh Harbor, he knocked on 2 doors that didn't answer. What are the chances that that actually happened?
The chances of that are essentially 0, because where we found the dinghy and where we observed him standing next to the dinghy early on that Sunday morning, we have a clear location of where that is in Marsh Harbor, and it is nothing but scrub bush, very thick scrub bush, directly to the west. And if you walked a great distance, hundreds of yards through thick brush, there's nothing there. There's eventually a little commercial building. And again, this would have been happening at 4 o'clock on Sunday morning. There would be no lights back there. It would be like making a decision to walk through the deepest, darkest jungle, heading due west into the island. Where the other option is, if you wash up on this shore in your dinghy, for the last 30 minutes you will have seen, or even longer, you would have seen the boatyard at Calcutta 150 yards to the north, and that boatyard is extremely brightly lit up at night.
The sound that shattered the quiet of the Sea of Abaco at around 9:30 that night was not the normal movement of the water or the shifting of a hull in the tide. It was a massive, unmistakable splash, a sudden and heavy disruption in the darkness right beside the 46-foot sloop named Soulmate, parked just 100 yards off the Bahamian shore. To the witness who heard it from the coast, the noise was significant enough to register instantly, a chilling punctuation mark in an evening that was supposed to be completely silent. This single audio event, newly brought to light by investigators and rescue personnel who were on the water hours later, completely upends the timeline that has been presented to the public for weeks. It places a violent, heavy physical event directly at the vessel at a time when the boat was supposed to be completely deserted, long after the official story claims both occupants had already vanished into the open ocean. If someone or something went into the water next to Soulmate at 9:30, then the narrative we have been given is not just incomplete, it is a structural fabrication. Stay with me because this is where it gets complicated, and it requires us to look past everything that was initially reported about the night Lynette Hooker disappeared. Until now, the public focus has been frozen on a chaotic sequence of events inside a small dinghy, where her husband, Brian Hooker, claimed his wife simply bounced off the back of the small craft and vanished into the waves, leaving him without keys, without power, and completely at the mercy of the sea. But this new revelation shifts our gaze away from the open water and locks it firmly onto the deck of their floating home, the place where they had lived together for 4 years. The massive splash heard by an onshore witness suggests that the tragedy did not begin miles away in a dark, out-of-control transit across the Sound, but right there, within eyesight of the luxury homes lining the shore. Think about that for a moment and ask yourself why a witness would hear a profound impact in the water at a time when Brian Hooker claimed to be drifting helplessly miles downwind, trapped in a disabled dinghy. To understand why this massive splash changes everything we thought we knew, we have to look closely at the logistical reality of the harbor and the people who were actually there to pull the pieces together.
Remember you telling me something very specific about what Brian was wearing when you rescued him that morning, just a few hours after he went up on the shore. What was he wearing that sort of doesn't go well with the whole description of the rocks being sharp on his feet?
He was wearing, I think the phrase that people use is sliders, but like a flip-flop. Slides. Okay. He was wearing slides, and they're fairly common down here. What maybe people would think of as flip-flops or something like that. Some of the rock can be rough, and in pitch dark, it would be challenging to walk across the rock. Sometimes people refer to it as moon rock because it's kind of spiky from thousands of years of erosion. But the flip-flops or the slides would have made it, very practical to work your way across the rocks. You certainly wouldn't decide to go inland through the almost impenetrable bush versus staying on the rocks on the shore.
And you'd keep your slides on while going over all that rough rock. And by the way, Nathan has showed us incredible video of what that rock really looks like. It does look very sharp. You keep your slides on.
Sure. Yeah, you would definitely keep them on.
Jim Todd, a dedicated volunteer with the Hopetown Volunteer Fire and Rescue, was one of the very first people to step onto a rescue vessel at 4 o'clock the following morning after Brian Hooker allegedly washed ashore at Marsh Harbor. For hours, Todd and his fellow volunteers operated under the assumption that they were dealing with a tragic boating accident, throwing all of their resources into searching the vast, unpredictable waters for a woman who had fallen overboard. They were operating on a timeline dictated entirely by a husband in distress, a man who claimed he had spent a terrifying night at sea, fighting the elements after his wife fell into the water with the ignition keys. But as the investigation transitions from a rescue mission into a forensic analysis, the physical geography of the Bahamas is beginning to expose deep flaws in that story. When Brian Hooker finally touched land that morning, he told family members and authorities a highly detailed sequence of events regarding his attempts to find help in the middle of the night. He claimed that after his dinghy ground into the shoreline of Marsh Harbor, he dragged himself out into the darkness, completely disoriented, and went knocking on the doors of 2 nearby homes, desperately seeking a telephone or a baseline of human assistance. He claimed that when no one answered his desperate knocks, he retreated to the roadside where he attempted to flag down a passing vehicle, only for the driver to accelerate and leave him stranded in the dark. It is a cinematic, harrowing image of a husband pushed to his absolute limits, isolated and ignored in a moment of profound grief. But when you place that narrative directly onto the actual terrain of Marsh Harbor, the entire sequence begins to dissolve into something entirely implausible. According to Jim Todd, who knows every foot of that coastline and surveyed the exact location where the dinghy was recovered, the probability of Brian Hooker knocking on 2 doors is essentially zero. The area where Brian and his dinghy actually came ashore is not a residential neighborhood with accessible front porches and streetlights. It is an incredibly dense, nearly impenetrable wall of tropical scrub bush. To move west from that specific shoreline means choosing to hack your way through a dark jungle in the dead of night, a task that would be physically punishing and logistically absurd for anyone genuinely seeking immediate emergency assistance. The terrain is thick, overgrown, and entirely devoid of structures for hundreds of yards, making the idea of a casual walk to a couple of residential front doors completely contradictory to the physical reality of the island. What makes this detail even more troubling is the alternative that lay directly in front of anyone standing on that beach.
All the way back to the boatyard.
Right, back through the difficult terrain that you would have had to cross to get to the subdivision.
Right. And let's just say you decided not to go through that horrible journey through the thickets and the inlet that you'd have to cross. You decided to go out via the roadway. That is a hell of a long walk to go out via the roadway.
Yes.
Yeah, none of it makes sense. But then also, these are homes that are occupied. These aren't like big, expensive vacation homes that people are sometimes in for a month or so a year. These are people
just
who
a short
live
distance
there
to the
in these
north,
homes in Marsh Harbor.
less than 150
absolutely.
yards
These are
away,
not,
sits the commercial
vacation
boatyard at
homes. They are
Kolkata,
real
a massive
people who
industrial landmark
live
that
and
is
work
famously
here.
and
There
brilliantly
are
lit up with high-intensity
hardworking
security
Bahamians
floodlights
who,
all night long. From the water and from the beach where the dinghy rested, this boatyard acts as a giant, unavoidable beacon of
And they would have
civilization and
answered the
safety,
door,
visible for miles
to a man
across
who
the
was
dark
in
harbor.
distress, who had
If a
just
person
been
were truly in
marooned
distress,
on the
escaping a
on
life
the
or
shore
the
of
ocean
Marsh Harbor.
crisis, and looking for immediate
they would
help,
have answered the
the
door
choices
and
would
given
not
help,
even be
and if
comparable.
they were
You would not
concerned,
choose to turn your
they
back
would
on a
have called the
massive,
police
brightly
and brought
illuminated
help.
industrial complex to instead
Yes.
wander deep into a pitch-black
Let's talk
jungle
about
of
this
thick scrub
vehicle,
bush
the
on the off
mystery
chance
man
of
that I
finding
put
a
out an
hidden
appeal
house.
to on the
This is the
podcast.
moment
If it
where we
was
have
you,
to
call
stop
me. I
and
don't
really
expect a
analyze the
call anytime
behavioral
soon.
choices being made,
What did you make
because
of
the
this
layout
story
of the
that I
land leaves
waved
no
down
room
a
for
passing
ambiguity.
car 4
A husband whose wife
in a
has just
remote
drowned or
area
vanished
of
into the
Marsh Harbor
ocean
where
does not have
I
time
don't-
to explore a dark thicket when an entire illuminated boatyard is sitting right along the flat shoreline, offering an immediate telephone, shelter, and medical assistance. Jim Todd noted that the shoreline, leading toward those bright lights of the boatyard, is composed of rough coastal rock, often referred to locally as moon rock because thousands of years of erosion have left it sharp, spiky, and highly uneven. Brian Hooker later told his mother-in-law that the sharp rocks had been brutal on his feet as he scrambled through the dark, an observation that seems to validate the difficulty of the terrain. But this is exactly where the small physical details of the rescue begin to clash violently with the spoken narrative. When Jim Todd hauled Brian Hooker up onto the rescue boat at the start of the search, he took immediate note of what the husband was wearing on his feet. He wasn't barefoot, and his feet were not lacerated by the unforgiving spiky moon rock of the Marsh Harbor shoreline. Instead, Brian was wearing a pair of standard slip-on footwear, commonly known as slides or flip-flops. As a seasoned islander and rescue officer, Todd knew immediately that if someone were wearing slides in the middle of a frantic pitch-black emergency, they would easily be able to walk along the coastal rocks to the brightly lit boatyard without sustaining injuries to their feet. More importantly, those same loose slides would make an intentional journey inland through the thick, tearing branches of the jungle scrub bush virtually impossible, as the footwear would catch, snap, or be pulled off within the first few steps. Think about the weight of these contradictions as they begin to pile up, transforming a simple tragedy into a complex web of logistical impossibilities. We are left with a story where a man allegedly bypasses a massive blazing landmark of safety, chooses instead to navigate an impenetrable jungle in loose sandals, and claims to knock on doors that physically do not exist in that sector of the coast. What do you believe happened on that shoreline in the early morning hours before the rescue boats were launched?
Down here is very helpful, and it's a small community, and if someone were standing in the road that appeared to be in distress, you would stop. And at the very least, you'd stop and roll down the window a little bit and have some communication, and then use your telephone to bring them aid. So,
you'd call the police, you'd do something.
Yeah. If the statement
Do you think these details are just the confused recollections of a traumatized survivor, or are we looking at a carefully constructed timeline designed to hide a completely different reality? Drop your thoughts and your theories in the comments below, because the deeper we go into the physical evidence of this case, the more the official story begins to fracture. Stay with me, because as the morning sun rose over the Bahamas and the rescue team finally approached the locked hull of the Soulmate, the timeline took an even more shocking and calculated turn. The structural breakdown of the official narrative deepened significantly when the rescue vessel finally arrived at the 46-foot sloop at approximately 7:45 that morning. Jim Todd, alongside Bahamian police officers, brought the rescue craft directly up to the stern of Soulmate, tying up along the starboard side in the brilliant morning light. Brian Hooker, who had spent the previous hours describing a harrowing, powerless ordeal at sea, immediately scrambled onto the deck of his vessel. He claimed to the authorities present that he was entirely locked out of his own home because Lynette had been carrying the only set of keys in her dry bag when she allegedly tumbled into the ocean. To regain entry, Brian walked over to an exterior air conditioning unit mounted on the deck and began tinkering with it, claiming he was searching for a hidden spare key he kept stashed away for emergencies. According to Todd, the entire process took less than a minute before the husband successfully unlocked the companionway hatch and disappeared down into the interior cabin with a police officer. This is where things get serious, because the next 60 minutes inside the belly of that boat created a profound technological anomaly that investigators are now treating as a focal point of the entire case. For exactly 1 hour, from 7:45 until 8:45 in the morning, Brian Hooker remained below deck with the Bahamian officer, ostensibly searching for registration paperwork, insurance documents, and identifying material to assist in the active search for his missing wife. During this hour, the volunteers on the rescue boat waited topside, floating in the calm water, observing no unusual sounds, no engines cranking, and no obvious signs of electrical activity from a heavily customized vessel. It appeared to be a standard, agonizingly slow administrative delay in the middle of a life-or-death crisis. But thousands of miles away, automated global maritime tracking systems were logging a silent electronic event that directly challenged the physical reality of what was happening inside that cabin. The Automatic Identification System, or AIS, is a high-frequency tracking transponder mandatory on modern vessels, designed to broadcast a ship's identity, precise GPS position, speed, and status to satellites and coastal receivers to prevent collisions and monitor maritime traffic. According to verified ship tracking data subsequently pulled by maritime analysts, the AIS transponder aboard Soulmate went completely dark, logging in out of coverage status. At exactly 9:29 on the Saturday night, Lynette vanished. For nearly 11 hours, the electronic heartbeat of the vessel was entirely non-existent to the global tracking grid, suggesting the ship had either suffered a catastrophic total power failure or the system had been manually deactivated. But at exactly 8:34 on Sunday morning, while Brian Hooker was deep inside the cabin under the supervision of a local officer, the transponder suddenly sparked back to life, broadcasting a clean, powerful signal to the maritime network. Think about that for a moment and analyze the absolute precision of that timing. The tracking system did not malfunction in the open ocean. It went offline less than 1 minute before a witness on shore heard a massive unexplained splash near the hull of the boat on Saturday night. It then remained completely dead throughout the entire night while Brian was allegedly drifting in the sound, only to magically reset and begin broadcasting the moment. The husband stepped back on board and gained access to his primary control panels. Jim Todd confirmed that while they were tied up to the hull, Brian had unrestricted access to the entire navigation station and electrical breakers while searching for documents. The logistical alignment is staggering, creating a scenario where the vessel's electronic tracking was perfectly suppressed during the exact window of Lynette's disappearance and instantly restored before the boat could be officially impounded or searched by higher authorities. This structural deactivation of the ship's tracking system cut straight through the defense of a chaotic, accidental drowning and hints at an entirely different level of technical calculation. If you believe this story deserves more attention and want to follow how this investigation develops as international forensic teams dissect the vessel, take a brief moment to share this video and subscribe to the channel now. When you look at the physical layout of Soulmate, it becomes obvious that this was not a basic, stripped-down recreational sailboat operated by an amateur. Jim Todd observed that the vessel was completely tricked out for heavy, long-term, independent cruising, featuring an extensive array of high-capacity solar panels mounted along the sides and heavy diesel and water jerrycans securely lashed to the deck. This was a blue water expedition rig designed to survive months away from civilization, functioning as a highly complex, self-sustaining modern home packed with sophisticated engineering. Furthermore, Lynette Hooker had previously documented in communications with her family that her husband was an absolute tech nerd, an individual who actively geeked out on networking the entire boat, integrating its various mechanical and electrical systems into centralized digital control panels. The two primary propulsion engines on the craft were specialized modern models equipped with built-in telemetric logging systems, capable of syncing directly to a smartphone or tablet via local networks to monitor fuel efficiency, battery life, and exact engine runtime down to the second. In essence, every single mechanical action taken on that boat, every flip of a breaker switch, and every rotation of an engine shaft left a permanent digital fingerprint inside the ship's onboard memory units. When the United States Coast Guard Investigative Service later seized the vessel at a station in Fort Pierce, Florida, their forensic agents were not just looking at a fiberglass hull, they were stepping into a digital crime scene. As the federal agents began wrapping the entirety of Soulmate in bright yellow crime scene tape, carrying off armloads of computers, tablets, hard drives, and navigation systems, it became clear that they had uncovered what sources are calling a forensic goldmine. Because Brian Hooker had a 4-day window between the initial disappearance of his wife in the Abacos and the moment he fled the Bahamas due to escalating local suspicion, the big question was always whether he had successfully wiped the ship's digital memory or removed critical hardware. But the sheer redundancy of modern marine electronics makes a complete data erasure almost impossible without physically destroying the engine modules and navigation cores themselves. The telemetric data trapped inside those engines can reveal exactly whether the boat remained completely stationary at its anchorage on Saturday night, or if it was secretly fired up and moved under the cover of darkness while the tracking system was manually disabled. This digital data is the exact point where the spoken timeline must eventually reconcile with physical science, leaving no room for human manipulation or convenient memory lapses. Consider the reality of a husband who claims to be so completely paralyzed by a sudden emergency that he forgets to throw his wife a life jacket, yet somehow possesses the presence of mind to be surrounded by an absolute blacking out of his vessel's satellite tracking at the exact hour of her disappearance. Ask yourself what the odds are that a sophisticated maritime transponder naturally suffers a technical failure at 9:29 in the evening and naturally repairs itself at 8:34 the following morning, right as the primary person of interest returns to the helm. Drop your analysis in the comments below, because we are no longer looking at an open and shut case of a tragic accident at sea. Stay with me, because as we pivot back to the physical search on the beaches of the Bahamas, logistical lies told about the geography of the islands begin to take on a far more sinister shape. The physical geography of the northern tip of Lubbers Quarters, the small island sitting directly across the shallow sound from where Soulmate was anchored, provides another devastating baseline of contradiction for the timeline Brian Hooker presented to the rescue team. On that Sunday morning, while sitting on the bow of the rescue craft with Jim Todd, Brian walked through a highly specific account of his movements during the late-night hours. He claimed that after Lynette supposedly vanished into the water, he found himself entirely trapped in the dinghy with a single broken oar, completely unable to restart the electric outboard motor because his wife had allegedly taken the electronic kill switch lanyard with her into the sea. He stated that as the heavy wind and current began to push his disabled craft southward down the channel, he made a conscious tactical decision to attempt to paddle toward the northern tip of Lubbers Quarters. His explicit plan, as he described it to the volunteers, was to run the dinghy aground on the island, locate one of the residential homes built along the shore, break through a window or door, and utilize their landline telephone to initiate a local emergency rescue. This explanation carries a veneer of survivalist logic, painting a picture of a desperate man attempting to utilize the local terrain to save his wife. But when you analyze the specific claim against the actual topographical and bathymetric reality of the Bahamian waters, the Narrative collapses into an impossibility that any experienced local boater would recognize instantly. The northern tip of Lubbers Quarters is not a deep-water shoreline where a craft can simply drift up to a dry beach. It is flanked by a massive, expansive shallow shoal that extends hundreds of yards out into the open water of the Sound. This shoal is so notoriously shallow and close to the surface that it serves as an absolute no-go zone for standard maritime vessels, as even a minor draft would cause a boat to ground out far from the actual tree line. Jim Todd noted that if Brian Hooker had genuinely drifted or paddled his small dinghy anywhere near that northern point, he would have hit bottom so far out that he could have easily stepped out of the craft and stood up in water that was barely waist-deep, or even knee-deep depending on the exact state of the tide. Think about that for a moment and consider the profound geographical deception required to make his story function. If Brian was genuinely within paddling distance of Lubbers Quarters with a broken oar, he was simultaneously within standing distance of safety, surrounded by a massive sandbar where he could have easily walked his craft to the dry shoreline or stabilized his position entirely. Instead, Brian claimed that right as he approached the northern tip, he suddenly threw out his small dinghy anchor and remained completely stationary, riding out the elements for approximately 1 full hour in the dead of night. He told authorities that it was during this specific 1-hour anchoring window that he retrieved his emergency flare gun and fired his distress signals into the dark sky, hoping to alert the surrounding islands before the anchor line supposedly failed or was pulled up, causing him to be blown miles across the Sea of Abaco toward his ultimate landing spot at Marsh Harbor. This 1-hour anchoring window at the northern tip of Lubbers Quarters is the exact structural pivot where the physical geography of the island intersects with the newly uncovered bombshell witness statements. For weeks, investigators have been plagued by a massive logical inconsistency regarding the emergency flares that a group of onshore witnesses reported seeing on the night of the disappearance. The initial police reports indicated that a cluster of people on land observed a bright crimson flare illuminating the dark sky at around 8 o'clock in the evening, a timeline that violently disrupted Brian's claim of a late-night disaster. Furthermore, maritime experts argued that if a standard emergency flare had been fired straight up into the atmosphere from the open water, it would have been visible to dozens of homes, anchored charter boats, and coastal businesses lining the entire Sound, triggering a massive, immediate community response that never occurred. But the mystery of why this flare went unnoticed by the broader public has finally been resolved by a critical detail regarding the precise trajectory of the launch. Jim Todd revealed that a closer forensic interview with the primary witness group has established that the flare did not arch gracefully into the upper atmosphere like a traditional distress signal. Instead, the witness observed a bright flash that traveled horizontally, moving on a completely flat, lateral trajectory directly across the surface of the water, staying low to the waves before burning out against the horizon. This horizontal trajectory changes everything we thought we knew about the intent behind that launch, explaining perfectly why the light was completely masked from the view of the surrounding hillsides and neighboring anchorages. A lateral fire across the water is not an engineered attempt to attract distant eyes. It is a suppressed, localized event that suggests the flare gun was being utilized for a completely different, potentially defensive or aggressive purpose close to the surface of the sea. Ask yourself why a husband who claims to be desperately searching the black water for his drowning wife would choose to fire his only emergency distress signals sideways across the waves instead of high into the heavens where help could actually see them. What do you believe this horizontal trajectory tells us about the true nature of the confrontation that was unfolding out on the water that night? Do you think this low-profile launch was a deliberate calculation to avoid alerting the local population? Or is there another, more frightening explanation for why a weapon of fire was aimed across the surface of the sea? Share your theories in the comments section below, because the overlapping timelines of the flare and the physical layout of the islands are beginning to trap the suspect in a vice of empirical data. Stay with me, because as we look past the low-profile flare, we hit the most devastating audio detail of all, the precise timing of the massive splash that occurred when the rest of the island had gone completely silent. The realization that the massive splash occurred much later in the evening, long after the general commotion of island life had ground to a complete halt, provides the final devastating piece of the chronological puzzle. Jim Todd clarified that the onshore witness who heard the impact did not experience it during the early evening hours when the local restaurants, docks, and coastal pathways were still echoing with the normal sounds of tourist activity and transit. Instead, the witness noted that the surroundings had become entirely still and quiet, an atmospheric shift that usually occurs well past 9 o'clock or 9:30 at night in that secluded sector of the coast. It was this deep ambient silence that allowed the sheer volume of the splash to carry so cleanly across the 100 yards of water separating the hull of Soulmate from the mainland. The audio profile was distinct, heavy, and isolated, indicating a sudden massive displacement of water that occurred at a time when Brian Hooker claimed both he and his wife were miles away, locked in a desperate struggle for survival in a drifting, powerless dinghy. When you look at this data point statistically, using the precise mathematical logic that rescue officers and investigators apply to conflicting testimonies, the probability of Brian Hooker's version of events being true rapidly approaches absolute zero. In statistical analysis, when a narrative requires multiple independent, highly unlikely events to all occur simultaneously to make the story function, you must multiply those individual probabilities together. To believe the husband's account, you must believe that the sophisticated satellite tracking system suffered a spontaneous technical failure at 9:29, that the wife managed to strip the electronic key and a heavy dry bag from the control console as she fell backward into rough seas, that she chose to swim away from a floating dinghy that was only 10 feet away, and that a massive, unexplained impact naturally occurred next to their empty sailboat at the exact same hour. When you multiply the fractions of those probabilities together, the resulting number is so minuscule that it defies human credulity, revealing a timeline that is mathematically impossible. Conversely, when investigators evaluate the alternative theory, they utilize the logic of addition rather than multiplication, because the various suspicious details function as independent, overlapping indicators of a single, continuous concealment. The horizontal trajectory of the flare, the sudden manual termination of the ship's electrical tracking, the presence of intact sandals on the feet of a man who claimed to navigate jagged coastal rock, and the late-night impact in the water all add up to support a uniform conclusion. This structural alignment of physical facts is exactly why international law enforcement agencies have focused their full energy on the technical layout of the boat. The presence of specialized network-integrated telemetric modules inside the vessel's primary engines means that the true story of that night is safely trapped in a digital format that cannot be argued away by a shifting verbal defense. The emotional weight of this technical trap is felt most deeply by Lynette's family, particularly her mother, Darlene, who is currently forced to endure the agonizingly slow progress of an international investigation from her home thousands of miles away. Jim Todd shared a profoundly heartbreaking detail from his recent private conversations with the family, revealing the deep systemic terror that preceded this tragedy. Darlene recounted that during her very last physical interaction with her daughter, she had clung to her and begged her not to return to the Bahamas, explicitly stating her terrifying premonition that her husband was ultimately going to kill her if she went back to that boat. Lynette had actually taken the brave step of contacting domestic abuse shelters, gathering professional guidance on how to safely disentangle her life from a toxic dynamic, and was actively holding an international airline ticket dated for March 11th to permanently escape the relationship. Tragically, the psychological complexities and unseen chains of domestic control pulled her back aboard the Soulmate before she could utilize that ticket, leaving her family to navigate a nightmare of unconfirmed details and structural obfuscation. This is not a closed chapter or a neatly packaged historical documentary. It is an active, evolving international incident where a mother is still waiting for the physical recovery of her daughter and the formal execution of justice. The digital records pulled from the ship's computers, combined with the chilling acoustics of the late-night splash, are steadily closing every avenue of escape for the individual responsible for this disappearance. As the federal agents conclude their forensic data downloads and prepare their final reports, the community remains entirely vigilant, refusing to let the memory of Lynette Hooker be washed away by the tides. Please take a final sincere moment to share this video across your platforms to ensure this story continues to receive the global attention it deserves. Drop your final analysis of the technical evidence in the comments below, and subscribe to stay tuned as the forensic truth finally comes to light.